wonderful seeing such a packed house. I'm Laura Zam. I'm the moderator for this session. I'm a health writer and a sexuality educator. And I'd like to present to you, first of all, this is Beyond Yes and No, Embodying Desire for Creative Collaborative Consent. So, just want to make sure everybody's in there. Okay. I would love to present to you Emma Daley, MA, who will be presenting this presentation. So Emma is completing her master's degree next month. In somatic counseling at Naropa University. Her capstone paper presents a model of consent based on body psychotherapy principles, many of which she'll be sharing in this presentation. Emma has led several consent workshops, including for the Boulder Housing Coalition Co-op system and at the Ontario Regional Contact Jam. She's also trained as an Our Whole Lives sexuality educator, and she has led both middle and high school groups in that curriculum. Emma's joining us from Boulder, Colorado, but she was born here in Philadelphia and will soon move back to Pennsylvania. Emma uses they and she pronouns. May I introduce Emma Daley? Great, thank you. Great. I'm sorry that we don't have more room.
This is Beyond Yes and No, Embodying Desire for Creative Collaborative Consent. Just want to let you know, I am videoing, but the camera is just on me, and I'll just be using that to review, to improve this in the future, and maybe pitch myself for future presentations. I don't want that to limit anybody from participating though, so if you want to speak up, if you'd rather your voice not be recorded, just talk to me after so I can edit it out. So this presentation will cover a few dimensions of how we tend to think about consent, including how it's defined and practiced, how it relates to desires and boundaries, and then how that impacts our relationships and our bodies. Because the way we practice consent literally impacts our ability to feel pleasure. Let's see. After going through what I think are the most common forms of consent, I'll build up to what I'm calling collaborative consent, or sometimes my collaborator and I call creative consent. I've been developing this material over the past year and a half with my collaborator, Fuzzy Konner. So if you would hear me say we around this material, that's who I'm referring to. And I'm hoping to get through the PowerPoint in time to lead some of the exercises we've developed. We don't really have much space, so I'll probably have you just turn to people next to you. But I'll try to guide you through at least some of those, to give you some tools for your own work. And then I'd love to have a conversation about how this might be adapted for different populations or settings. This stuff is all still very much in the works, so I would love to hear from you afterwards. I do want to keep in track in terms of time, so I'll ask you to hold general questions and discussion to the end, but please do let me know if you have clarifying questions or any accessibility needs that I'm not meeting. If you need me to slow down or speak up, please let me know. Finally, this is a workshop on consent and mutual desire, so please take care of yourself. Please only stay if you want to be here. And I mean, really, whatever you need to do with your body to stay engaged, make me very happy to see you do that. So, I'm going to start right in the middle of the title here and talk about this word embodied. So, I have a body. Doesn't that make me embodied? By some definitions, yes, but the way we use it in body psychotherapy, and especially the way I'm using it here, embodiment means bringing present moment awareness to sensations and movements, including muscle tension, posture, nervous system activity, anything at all happening in the body. And one of the reasons that we do this is because we find that our bodies actually hold information, especially around our subjective experience of the world. In body psychotherapy, we believe that all the ways of knowing that pre-exist our frontal cortexes still exist in our bodies and our brains, and that if we bring those into awareness, we can actually live more fully. So one way of thinking of this is shifting from having an experience of your body to having an experience as your body. I encourage you to try that on as we go through here and really get a sense of how your body experiences desire and pleasure. Now, to access the information that our bodies hold, we need qualities of curiosity and non-judgment. Right? To really embody embodiment requires letting go of cognitive control you're anything like me, you might like to understand things quickly, so you have a sense of them and you can know what's happening. But we really have to learn to listen to the body in its own language, which largely is sensations and movements. And lastly, embodiment can refer to the way things manifest in our bodies. So we embody social norms, emotions, and patterns that develop as a result of experiences. So to get this grounded and to give you a baseline for a lot of the things I'll be talking about, I'd like to invite you into just sort of a guided body scan, basically, to get a sense of how yes and no map in your own body. So we're going to keep it mild, right, knowing that you're in a presentation here. But I invite you to just start noticing the chair or the floor under you. Get a sense of your feet and where your breath are. If it helps you to notice your body, to close your eyes and you feel safe with that, go ahead. Otherwise, just soften your gaze however you pay attention to yourself best. And slowly just bring to mind something that you know you would not like right now. Right? Something mildly unpleasant. Maybe the sound of your alarm clock or going to the dentist. Start to notice what happens in your body when you really visualize something that you would not like. What gets tense? What happens to your breath? Does anything relax? Do you notice any impulses? We're just going to take a few more seconds here just to notice what happens. And then again, noticing the floor, your seat under you. Shake that one off, and we're going to move into the positive. Resetting yourself. This time we're going to imagine something that you would like. Okay, anything at all. Food, touch, sunshine, something that would feel really good and nourishing to you right now. Really imagine that. Get a sense of it in your body. Notice what happens here. Where are those subtle movements? Any changes in temperature? Tension, relaxation, breath. Just a few more seconds to find this map of yes. And then again, begin bringing your attention back to the room, noticing your body here in this space around you. I'm interested in just a couple of quick shares. What did you find first around no? What did a boundary feel like in your body?
Hot.
You got hot?
Tense.
Some tension. Some clenching.
Froze movement?
Frozen. Yeah.
No, frozen the moving. Freezing the movement of the body.
Freezing movement.
Yeah.
So no, yeah. Right, not temperature freezing, motion freezing.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
My vagina clamps up.
Yeah. That's some guarding happening.
Pressure.
Pressure. And how about around yes? What happened there? You might hear a lot of breath.
Relaxation.
More relaxation.
I felt warmer, actually.
Yeah, pleasant warmness. What else? Did anybody notice like any little movements or impulses in their bodies?
Swaying.
Swaying? Okay. Toes wiggling?
Oozing.
Oozing?
Yes.
Yep.
Leaning forward.
Some leaning forward. Yeah. Yeah, so often with no, people will find senses of like pulling away, closing off, right? Turning away from things. A lot of the tension and guarding happens there. And much more opening and relaxing and even moving toward with yes. Which of those sounds more conducive to pleasure? And a couple of people mentioned some temperature changes, sometimes there's changes in breath. Those can happen in the nervous system under both excitement and fear. So some of these somatic cues around movement and senses of being guarded or open can really help distinguish what's happening as opposed to just that raw nervous system activity. So, let's This is how I'm categorizing the first three here, the most common forms, I think, of consent that are out here, and then collaborative is what I'll be moving into. I'm going to start with ambiguous consent, both because it's the oldest and the most complicated. It's also often overlooked, I think, as even constituting consent. So ambiguous consent includes at least two different things, right? Saying yes to unwanted sex and saying no to wanted sex. Now, as enlightened 21st century sexuality professionals, I know you're thinking that yes shouldn't be taken at face value if there's no enthusiasm. It's not even valid, right, if there's any kind of coercion, and that no always has to be respected, even if it seems like there's also desire. That's, I hope, what we've all been trained in. But ambiguous consent is more complicated, and it pre-exists our ideas of negative or affirmative consent. So the form I'm going to focus on is what researchers have called token resistance to sex. So it's where you're saying yes, but you actually want, or you're saying no, sorry, but you actually want your yes to be understood. And there are at least a few reasons someone might do this. Generally, it's about reputation or fitting into gender roles. So to understand this, I want to look at the traditional heteronormative script around sex. You know, the one where everybody is cis and binary and straight, and sex is something that men try to get and women protect. Right? Now, I know this might be a stretch for some of you, but just imagine being born into a society like that. And being assigned and let's say that you actually do identify as a woman and you do have male partners. At some point, you want to have sex, but you have all this pressure on you not to, right? Sex is something you're not supposed to give up too easily, right? You don't want to be labeled as easy or a slut. Right, those derogatory terms, it's not always about the fact of having sex, it's about it being easy to get you to have sex, right? So in order to fit this social expectations and preserve your reputation, you have to put up a little bit of resistance, even when you want it, right? So, make sure I don't get off track here. So you might say no, right, to protect your reputation, but you also need a way of communicating, actually a yes, right? I actually do want this. So we have these different tracks of communication, right? We have verbal communication and we have nonverbal. So you might verbally say no, but use your body to say yes. Right? So this is ambiguous consent. And if you're in a system where everybody involved understands the system of communication you're using, it's a valid way to consent. Right? We have always had to invent communication that fits the circumstances we're in. The problem is when we start moving out of that system, some people are still in it, and some people are starting to move into a system that says, I'm actually entitled to my own desire, and I get to have boundaries. So there's also a lot of miscommunication that ambiguous consent understands, and it limits people's ability to say no, because we take away the verbal no. So moving into negative consent, this is the no means no model, right? As we became aware of all the sexual assault and harassment that the ambiguous consent model actually enabled, and as we started saying, actually women are allowed to have sexual desire, now we get to have boundaries also, right? So now no has to be respected as no. And before I understood ambiguous consent, I used to have this outrage around no means no. Like, why do we have to say that? Like, what else would it mean, right? But then I realized that actually there's this system where no doesn't always mean no. And it's not actually unreasonable that people might interpret things differently if they're coming out of that system. So it's important to recognize both historically and because you're going to have clients and students who are still being socialized in that. So, what do I want to say about no? Let's see. Yeah, so this means we have clearer communication, but it also has problems. It's a really low bar for pleasure, right? In this model, we're assuming that if you don't get a no, you're good. But it doesn't ask anywhere about what your partner wants, right? So it's totally framed by the person initiating, and then the yes and no are binary. Right, so either whatever's initiated, whatever's suggested, is either allowed or rejected. Right? So there's nothing here about mutuality. And it's also problematic because not everybody is equally capable of saying no. Right? Experiences of marginalization or other forms of trauma can teach people either that their voices don't matter or that they can expect to have their boundaries violated. So this might work if everybody were good at no, but the reality is that they're not, and we can't expect everybody to be equally good at no. So the next step in this evolution was affirmative consent, where the tagline is yes means yes. Right? And here you're actually starting to aim at desire. Right? What do you want? And this opens the avenues to mutuality. It still doesn't entirely require it. Questions here might often be framed in yes or no form still. But we start to orient toward pleasure. And as you just discovered in your bodies, orienting toward things you want actually open you more to experiences that are going to allow pleasure to flow, allow you to notice new desires as they come up, because you're not all tensed off. So affirmative consent is a major step forward in a lot of ways. And I made this table just to summarize these ones. And this edit didn't show up, but this only should be down here, where it's only yes that means yes. So in ambiguous consent, it allowed expression of desire where you're not actually allowed to say what you want. And it allows people to protect reputation. But it also denied desire for some people, limits the ability to say no, invites miscommunication. Negative consent, we have clearer communication, acknowledges that we actually have our own desires and boundaries. I think I talked about all of those problems with it. And then with affirmative consent, we don't need people to be able to say no quite as much if we're aiming for the yes. And because of aiming for the yes, there's less risk of violation. But there also tends to be an emphasis on verbal communication with affirmative consent, especially because of getting that yes ahead of time. And people find that kind of interrupts flow, right? Because there is a naturalness to bodies moving together without words. And sometimes that means people will revert to negative consent. And then we still have this issue of it being sort of a binary yes-no. And now there's also an issue that not everybody knows their desires. Right? And that's part of our work, is to help people get in touch with their desires. But that wasn't previously as much of a problem because it wasn't really focused. And now that becomes more of a problem. So our goal was to look at consent and say, is there a way that we can let people be less afraid of consent, right? Less focused on having their boundaries violated, and more focused on the pleasure that they can get. How can we use consent as a way of promoting sexual wellness, right? And not just of preventing violence. So I want to just give you a sneak peek of where we're headed. I'm going to build up to this over the rest of the presentation. But basically there's a lot here about communication, identifying your desires, and really orienting toward the desires. And then just incorporating in any model of consent, being aware of possible impacts of trauma or power imbalances. So, let's see. I got ahead of myself on my notes. All right. So first I want to look at a few more of these dimensions of consent. So the first, I mentioned with both negative and affirmative consent, where the yes-no are binary. That you're either accepting or rejecting whatever is suggested. And that's important because it also directly translates into how we understand consent itself. So here I have a bar that on one side is red, on the other side is green with a dividing line, and it's either rape or consent. Right? So we end up with this binary understanding of consent. And this is terrifying, right? Like, you can very quickly move from having fun with somebody you feel good with into all of a sudden being in really problematic territory, right? And you might not even see it coming because this line can move around. This is also really bad for relationships because it paints things in absolutes. It sets people up to be adversaries and arguing over where this line is going to be. I skipped a page, but there they are. Yeah, so this doesn't put people in relationship because everybody is either guarding against being a victim or a perpetrator. I also don't think that this is accurate. You've probably heard of people who have been victims of sexual assault not wanting to press charges or not even wanting to call what they've experienced rape. I think among feminist circles, I tend to hear that portrayed as weakness or caring too much about the perpetrator. And sometimes it is because of care for the person or other people who would be impacted. But I think we also have to consider that if people's behavior doesn't match our model, the model might be wrong. So I think reality looks more like this, where we have this spectrum from red to green, and on this end, this is where assault happens, and on this end is where really good sex happens. And in between, you might still ethically have consent. It's just going to be, not great sex. So I think we need to give people a model and corresponding skills to navigate this reality. To start doing that, I want to look at what happens when we overlay two people's consent spectrum. Right? So if this is your consent of things that are absolutely not okay to things that you love, I'm going to look at two people now. So if this circle is things that partner A would like to do with partner B, and we make a Venn diagram by adding the things partner B would like to do with partner A, then in the middle we have this zone of mutual desire. Right? Sometimes in my workshops I call this the Venn vagina. This is where the really juicy, delicious interactions are going to happen. Right? So this is what we want to get people aiming for, right? And this is going to produce the most pleasure. We can also give us a little more space, and we can add the circle of things that A is willing to do, right? Things they're not enthusiastic about, but they're okay with. So now we get this additional zone. We get these additional zones here, where it's sort of, instead of the zone of mutual desire, you might have the zone of, nah. Right, so that happens on either side, the things that A wants that B is willing to do, or that B wants that A is willing to do. And of course you could add in any other number of circles, if this is more than two people we're talking about. And then we also have these orange zones where it's things that they're both willing to do, but neither person is enthusiastic about. So we know that the most pleasure is going to happen in here. Not just the most combined pleasure because it's acts that they both want to be doing, but because we're going to be generating those really open, moving in, connective sort of body states that we talked about earlier. And this is where we're going to be able to get into those upward spirals, where the connection and arousal sort of seem to feed on themselves.
Is this your model, just to be clear?
Yes. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, we're starting to, thank you. Yeah, we're starting to move into the, so the things that Fuzzy and I have sort of thought about along the way that built us up to that list that I showed that we'll come back to. So yes, this is our model. This is the mutual desire aspect of it. So, it's certainly okay and sometimes good to agree to things that you're not enthusiastic about, right? Like giving your partner pleasure is a perfectly good motivation. And for some people, their partner's pleasure is one of the biggest turn-ons, and that could put almost anything into the green zone. Right? But whatever those things are, where it's really going to produce those desirous body states, that's what we're aiming for. And then the other thing that this does is that this yellow and orange band around here gives us a buffer, right? If we aim for the green zone of mutual desire, then we've got a buffer of things being okay, where there's actually some room to fail at doing consent really well before we get to these lines past which people aren't willing to go, right? So I'm going to make those red just to make them a little clearer. So that's another thing that we think is really important about this, is that aiming for mutual desire should actually also function as a better tool for prevention. And we see that same buffer back in this spectrum, right, where we have the yellow and orange in the middle between the really good sex and the really problematic sex. Here it just reflects one person's desire, And here it reflects the level of mutuality. So I was talking about creating those upward spirals, right, where arousal sort of like builds on itself, right, and you're in really good connection with another person. So I want to talk about how that happens a little bit. I imagine a lot of you are probably familiar with this model, so I'm going to keep it pretty brief. Basically, I want to talk about this because finding overlapping desires is not just about finding things that you like the idea of, but things that actually turn you on in real life. So the dual control model proposes that sexual arousal, like many other functions of the human nervous system, is not just an on-off switch or even a spectrum from on to off, but actually consists of two independent systems, one that excites and one that inhibits. So basically these are your turn-ons and turn-offs. Emily Nagoski compares them to the accelerator and brakes in a car. And these both have state and trait characteristics. The trait is how sensitive you are to each of these, and again, that's independent of each other. For overlaying consent on this, I'm going to focus on the state attribute. Right? So how each of these is activated, right, regardless of your sensitivity. Now something that's important here is that we don't get to choose our exciters or inhibitors, and they're not always directly sexual. They both often have more to do with context than with specific sexual acts. For example, for most people, though not all, stress and fear are inhibitors, whereas being in a situation where sex has happened before is often an exciter. Our brains are masters of association. And whatever your particular exciters are, for purposes of consent, those are largely what I'm calling desires. Because we don't get to choose our exciters, sometimes we have exciters that we sort of wish we didn't have, right, or that might be ethically problematic. But for the most part, exciters are reasonably unproblematic, and those are the ones I'm referring to here, the ones that we can use to really support our own arousal. And then I think of boundaries as connected to the inhibition system. I think conventional thinking about consent, especially like the no means no model, would say that's because inhibitors tell us that we've reached a boundary or we need to enforce a boundary. And sometimes that's true, but we can also set up boundaries intended to promote arousal by protecting us from our inhibitory responses. So let's take a look at how that could work. So around negative consent, boundaries are about what you don't want. But focusing on what you don't want makes your body close off, tense, pull away. And sometimes that's good. If you're in an interaction you don't want to be in, these are the responses you want to have. But I'm concerned that thinking about boundaries as just keeping out what we don't want could actually produce these body states even when we do want to be having sex. So in comparison, if we're orienting toward boundaries as a way to protect the space for us to allow arousal to develop in, then I think we can stay focused on our desires while sort of trusting our boundaries to just hold the container. Yes?
I don't know if you're welcoming questions, but with the previous slide, you said that sometimes the body will, is that based on like muscle memory or just the body being comfortable in that tense sort of space?
Yeah, so the body reactions that we see, they come from all kinds of places. So they come from billions of years of evolution, right? I mean, even on the cellular level, we see that cells close off and move away from noxious stimuli and will open and move toward nourishing stimuli, all the way up to experiences that we've had in these bodies in these lifetimes, where it's more of a learned response. But basically, if the body is perceiving a threat, it's going to try to protect itself. Whereas if the body is perceiving something nourishing or pleasant, then we're going to try to move into that and allow it to come in. So I'm going to compare this, just thinking about boundaries this way. So if you imagine that you're on a playground, it's got all your favorite equipment, you're playing on it, you're having a great time, and then a mean dog shows up. It's going to be harder to enjoy the playground, even though it still has all your favorite equipment on it. But if we have a fence around the playground, and you trust that fence to keep the dog out, you're going to be able to go back to playing and enjoying. I don't know if this takes the analogy too far, but I think of negative consent, or a more boundary-oriented version of consent, as sort of standing at the fence and worrying about whether it's going to keep the dog out. And a more pleasure-oriented as trusting in the fence and saying, I know it's there, and so I'm safe here to do the things I'm going to have fun with. So the next dimension of consent that I want to look at is this idea of being transactional or relational. And by transactional sex, or transactional consent, I basically mean a model that sort of objectifies sex in some way, right? As something to get, as an achievement, an obligation, right? And when I imagine consent this way, I sort of sense it in my body as like something outside of me, as opposed to something that I create. And I notice that I actually feel kind of disconnected from myself when I think about this. And on the flip side, relational consent prioritizes the connection and the creativity of sex. And when I say creativity, I don't necessarily mean like dressing up or having sex in new places, but just responding to what's happening in each moment, right? And allowing things to unfold with authenticity and spontaneity, and prioritizing the relationship over specific sex acts. In relational sex, you actually embrace not knowing exactly what's going to happen. That's part of the fun of it. So when I imagine this kind of sex, I feel my body actually preparing by becoming more present, because I can only be in a relationship if I'm really here. So I want to look at some of the characteristics of each of these. The first one we talked about a little bit, this binary versus spectrum understanding of yes and no. Second, the guiding question in each. In transactional, the question is, what do I want? And in relational, we get to, what do we both want? What's here in this shared space? And that leads into these goals of either getting what I want or creating positive connection. In transactional consent, my partner's boundaries are potentially an obstacle to me getting what I want. And my own boundaries actually sort of put me at risk of violation in the event that they're in conflict with my partner's desires. Whereas in relational consent, boundaries are information. Okay? They're information that guides us closer to that zone of mutual desire. And they actually present an opportunity for me to respect my partner and help them feel safe. For you neuroscience nerds out there, transactional, all of these characteristics here are likely to activate this dorsal vagal response, which is about survival, as opposed to the ventral vagal, more social engagement response. And those in turn, here we're going to have either fear or anger under transactional, where sex is objectified, you're either getting it or you're not. And in relational, we have something more like curiosity. Now these are certainly not strictly cyclical, but they do feed back on each other. Okay? From a state of curiosity, you're going to be more open to sort of a spectrum and listening. And from a place of fear or anger, it's much more likely that you get this narrow focus going on. Skip over to communication. First off, I just want to say that I think the fact that we treat consent as separate from other forms of sexual communication is probably where a problem is. That if we really understood consent as this just ongoing pursuit of what will bring the most pleasure, that it would just be part of continuous communication throughout sex. And let's see, so like I said before, affirmative consent has often come with a push for verbal communication, right? And there's a lot of good reasons for that, right? Words are able to talk about the future in ways that bodies aren't, and words allow for certain types of clarity in ways that body doesn't. I recently finished teaching a round of our Whole Lives high school group, and I was really struck by how certain they are that consent has to be a verbal yes. And that's a pretty good place to start, right? But I also think we need to think about what else is going on. So just to drive this home, I want you to imagine that you're touching somebody, and they say, yeah, that feels good. So why are you laughing? That was clear verbal communication. I assume that you attuned to my body language, right, and noticed the incongruence between my verbal and nonverbal. So in body psychotherapy, we talk about ways to actually develop attunement skills. Most people have some innate capacity for this. It's how infants attach to caregivers. And the congruence part, I like to think about that not just between those systems of communication, but also among parts of ourselves. Right? When we have congruence among different parts of ourselves giving this yes message, that's when we have that hell yes. So words are incredibly useful, but studies of sexual communication indicate that people also commonly use nonverbal consent, and they view it as valid and useful. So I'm not trying to get rid of words. Like I said, words and body language are just generally good at expressing different things. But words can be legitimately hard to come by when arousal is hard, or when arousal is high, because of what's happening neurologically. And again, there is a naturalness, right, to bodies flowing together that can become really stilted when we try to run it through cognitive circuits. So we just have to do it in ways that promote enjoyment for everybody, right, and not recapitulate unwanted power dynamics. Now, anytime we talk about communication styles, it's important to acknowledge differences due to culture, family background, neurodiversity, right, so things like ADHD or autism, because all of these will affect how a person expresses, interprets, and feels about both verbal and nonverbal communication, as well as what they're inclined or even able to pay attention to. The good news is that we can talk about it. Right? So one of the things that we do in our model of consent is just encourage people to talk about, hey, how do you like to communicate? Right? How will I know if you're having a good time? How do you like to communicate consent? So there's no one right way to communicate. There's just what works for any given set of people. So through conversation and feedback, we can get better at attuning to each other and making accurate interpretations there. So I'm going to come back to this red and green spectrum as we talk about communication. When it comes to verbal communication, we really like to encourage people to use desire-oriented language so that as you're in conversation, you're starting already to create those open body states. So at the red end, you're probably not actually using words, but the attitude here would be, I'm going to do whatever I want. And then in the middle, we have questions like, is this okay? Can I? Will you? Right? These are sort of negative consent questions. You're making sure you're not crossing somebody's boundaries. But you're still not asking about their desires here. And then I actually want to zoom in on that end of the spectrum over there, because there's some in the middle here where we have yes-no affirmative questions and desire-oriented questions. But these are still yes or no questions, right? Would you like me to? Do you want? Right? But this is still being framed by the person asking the question. At the far end, what we really encourage people to do is ask open-ended questions. Okay. What would feel good right now? How do you want to be touched?
Continue on Market Street.
That's open-ended.
About what would be good for our partner. And then we get to check in with ourselves, right? Does that excite those desirous body states for us? Right? And if both people are doing that, it's not going to take very long to find something that's really in that green zone of mutual desire. And coming back to these questions over here in the middle of the spectrum, it's certainly good to speak to your own desires, right? We want to encourage people to do that in ways that actually step into the vulnerability of really naming your own desire, right? Because sometimes, even these ones in here, actually, let's look at these. Sometimes these are guesses at what your partner wants, and sometimes they're actually requests that are veiled as offers. So we really like to encourage people to step into that vulnerability and say, here's what I want. Right? And our favorite way of saying that is, if you're into it, I would love to. Right? So if you would like it, I would love to put my tongue in your nose, right? Right, and then it's making my desire for it actually contingent on your desire for it.
Question?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this might be a nuanced thing, but let's say you're in a partnership where it's unequal, like with power differential, and the person in the position of power is like, I would, if you really want to do this, I would do, you know, like, but like there's still that like, that inherent, like you need to do what I want to do.
Yes.
I'm curious where that falls.
It falls 2 slides from now.
No longer on Market Street, I'm sorry.
So I do want to talk a little bit about trauma responses here. This is something that I don't hear talked about necessarily paired with consent all the time, but it can really influence how we respond to initiatory behavior, what we express with our bodies, right? Because even a partner who is sort of listening for those nonverbal cues as well as the verbal ones might not know how to interpret something that's actually coming from a trauma response. So very briefly, trauma responses are automatic responses that are based in some kind of past experience. It's not necessarily that a person is experiencing a full flashback, but their body is reacting in some automatic way, and they may or may not know what the past or the present trigger is for that. It might include any of these nervous system responses: fight, flight, freeze, faint, where they get into sort of a dissociated state. These last two, the freeze and the faint, are especially dangerous because then there's no communication happening. There may also be other specific patterns that emerge for that person. So we like to really emphasize to people, if you see a freeze in your partner, stop, right? Check in. That is communication, right? It's saying that something's not right. We emphasize this one in particular because people operating in that no means no model, they're just going to interpret a freeze as not no. If you're frozen, you can't say no. And even in the affirmative consent model, if you've already gotten prior consent for the thing that you're doing, and then they're frozen, then that might just be everything is fine, keep going. And I also think it's good to ask about this ahead of time. You don't want to be crass about it, but just as you're getting to know each other, right? Just like we can say, how do you like to communicate consent, right? How will I know if you're having a good time? You can also say, is there anything I should look out for that happens when you're not okay? And that helps establish that relationship and sort of that sense of teamwork in what you're creating early on. So power imbalances, I would say, are always present. Right? Whatever experiences from socialization we have, our sociocultural identities, all give us different relationships to power, to our abilities to express yes or no. So obviously this model works best if everybody involved is on board and is using this model, right? And that's true of any form of consent. If you have somebody who is trying to use coercion, that's just problematic and it's not consensual no matter what model you're using. But assuming that we're trying to create those dynamics, we like to encourage people to actually explore ahead of time with each other, how comfortable are you saying no to me? Right? And how comfortable are you expressing your desires? Right? So sort of checking in and doing some of the work ahead of time to lay the groundwork so that partners can support each other in actually being able to say no or being able to express desire. If one person is much faster to that or much more comfortable with that than the other, that second person might need some support, right? And the partner could offer that support in sort of giving them more space or asking particular questions that help them to check in with themselves. So again, it's not preventing coercion, right? But it's saying as long as coercion isn't the goal, there are ways that we can actually talk with each other, just name whatever power imbalances are there, and then figure out together how to work the rules. Now, extreme imbalances, right? We have a student and a teacher, an employee and an employee. That's probably a good time not to enter into a sexual relationship when somebody really has some really significant real world power over the other person. Obviously, this is not the same as consensual dom-sub relationships where all that consent conversation is happening ahead of time. Right? So I am hoping I'll still have time to give you some of our exercises here. So, so here again is this list. Now that I've gone through those different dimensions of consent, some of the different things that we've been thinking about in building up to this. So these are some of our general guidelines in practicing consent collaboratively. Okay, so talking about communication ahead of time. And do you like to have verbal check-ins? Are you comfortable with nonverbal and telling you something's not okay? Doing that ahead of time really helps to sort of cultivate this teamwork and relational approach right off the bat. And then identifying and communicating your desires and boundaries and really letting your body help guide you to that. Because again, it's not just that the information is there, but when you're able to orient toward those desires, then the desire is actually able to express itself in your body even more. And then we talked about letting boundaries be a container as opposed to a threat. Using desire-oriented language to help us pay attention to the things that get our bodies into those pleasurable states. And then we just talked about being trauma-informed and aware of power dynamics. We also have some extra tips. Using more verbal communication early in a relationship, or when you're trying something new with a partner. It's just good to have that extra clarity, do some of that talking about making sure you're interpreting each other's signals correctly. Share what you know, ask what you don't. Basically refers to let your partner know what's going on for you and be curious about what's going on for them. Right? Really try to garner all that information about what's happening in the whole system. Easy to say no to. Right? We talked about no as a gift. It's a gift of authenticity or honesty, but it's also a gift that's guiding you closer to that mutual desire. Right? We try to help people think that there might be some particular act that you think you want, but what you really want is the mutually desired version of that act. Right? Can you raise your hand if you can think of somebody that you would like to kiss? Anybody in the world, somebody that you would like to kiss. Now keep your hand up if you would still like to kiss them if you knew that they didn't want to kiss you. Right, the desire might still be there, right? But you probably wouldn't actually enjoy it or try to have it happen. That's not the way that you want it to happen. So we ask people to actually say thank you when they hear a no. Right? Thank you for being clear. Thank you for taking care of yourself. Standing consent, very, very briefly, is basically just a way of saying, hey, unless I say otherwise, this thing is okay with me. Right? You can put some context on it, like you can give me a hug anytime unless I'm holding a sharp object. But it's basically a way of switching from you need to get a yes every time, sort of switching into that negative model, but with this overarching yes on it already. And finally, just knowing that accidents happen. Right? We're really trying to encourage people to build up their consent in a way that promotes that relationship so that when accidents happen, we don't jump to that binary, now you crossed the line and this was a sexual assault, but actually giving people the space in their relationships to give each other a little bit of grace and say, hey, that didn't feel good to me. Can we talk about that? And to really listen, take in the feedback. If somebody says that you did something that wasn't okay with them, right, how do you stay engaged around that? So that is what I've got. This was our tables. I'm just going to add collaborative consent down at the bottom here. So we talked about a lot of the benefits of this, creating even more pleasure through mutual desire in both the acts and the body states that creates. We're acknowledging more nuance here, trying to create a buffer instead of just a single line of assault, creating a buffer around doing consent really well versus when we get into territorial assault. It's more open-ended, so it generates more creativity. I think this oscillation between what's going on for me and what's going on for my partner should help promote connection. Also, you're not just existing in your own little world, we're asking people to actually go back and forth between their world and their partner's world to create more of a shared experience. And then good sex is its own reward, right? So we're hoping that this becomes a self-reinforcing model. We're teaching people that good sex is possible, that they'll be motivated to do that, right? And that good sex is a better reward than like, got through another day without being accused of rape, you know? There certainly will be some problems with this. Again, I talked earlier about not everybody being in touch with their desires. That would obviously still be an issue here. We're hoping that some of the embodiment that we're doing helps people get in touch with that, but could certainly be the subject of more intensive or targeted personal individual work. It's possible that the level of effort involved here or the level of communication skill required could be a barrier for some folks. Again, I'm hoping that the rewards of it will help some people be motivated around that. I think the communication issue means that we need to teach communication as we teach consent, not that we should lower the bar on consent. So I'm curious to see where this goes. I don't know what the next form of this will be, or what some of the problems that emerge will be. But I'm sure there will be, but I also think that this starts to address some of the problems that previous models have had. So in conclusion, obviously consent is important for ethical reasons, right? Not harassing people or committing sexual assault. But we can also use consent to focus on the things that we really want and that make us feel good. I think previous models of consent have put these two things right up against each other, but that by practicing consent well, really being in our bodies, being in communication with each other, we can start to move the definitions of sexual assault and consent apart from each other and create interactions that leave everybody feeling good. So my email address is down here. I'll also put my cards out. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I could either describe to you some of the exercises that we talked about, or I could take questions. I'm also available after, and I'll put my cards out. So our workshops basically take people through that embodiment exercise. We actually start by having them do an exercise in saying no. Really, even if your folks are already sort of well-versed in the affirmative consent model, really encourage you not to skip over work around no. It always brings up stuff for people around being rejected or hurting people's feelings. So we often do that in a group where we just have people mill around and offer each other hugs. And for the first round, you're just saying no, okay, and just experiencing what it feels like to say no. And even though you know that you're going to say no, really encouraging people to get in their body, take a breath, notice what it feels like to say it, notice what it feels like to hear it. Then I take them through that embodiment exercise so that they get a sense of where their genuine yes and no is. And then we do the same exercise where they can say yes if they want to. We also encourage folks to still try saying no at least once during that round. It's different to say no when you're allowed to say yes than it is when you're supposed to say no. And then we also created an exercise that we call Beyond Yes and No. Actually, could you demonstrate this with me? So in this one, we have people walk around. That is horrible. We have people walk around, come to face somebody, and then just take a moment to notice what they would like to do with this person. And when they notice something, they say, ready. 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 Okay. So in the interest of equalizing power dynamics, we have the person who was ready second share their desire first. So what's the thing you'd like to do?
I would like to squeeze your hands.
Okay. Mine was that I would like to stand next to each other and jump up and down. So then we have people practice negotiating something that would be in both of their desire. Right? So it might be a combination of those two things. It might be one and then the other. I might say, oh, I didn't even think of that. I like yours way better. Let's do that. If there's no overlap with these, you can keep talking, see if you can find something that would be in both of your joy. So that might look like, well, how about, would you like to hold hands and jump up and down with me?
Yeah.
Yeah? So you have people all over the room doing things like that. And there's a surprising amount of joy that comes out of it. So just really sort of driving home this idea of the mutuality and the creativity of it, even in a non-sexual context. There are other ways that you can do all these different kinds of exercises. We also developed a nonverbal, where basically they sort of try to do some version of that, but without words, and it pretty much just turns into contact improv. So that's like a super quick overview of the arc of our workshops. I will put my cards out on the table, and my email address is at the bottom of this last slide. Yeah, so I think we're at time, right? So I'll be around if you have other questions. Sorry, the PowerPoint went long. Thank you for being around.